The vibration against my right hip bone defied the standard haptic pattern of a smartphone notification. It was a mechanical buzz, low frequency, jagged, and aggressively persistent, emanating from the analog pager clipped inside the waistband of my oversized scrubs. I hadn't felt that specific frequency in 3 years. It felt like phantom limb pain from a life I had legally cremated and buried under mountains of redacted paperwork. Outside the ambulance bay, the Chicago storm hammered against the reinforced glass, a chaotic, drowning rhythm of freezing rain and hail that usually soothed me. But inside Trauma Bay 4, the air pressure dropped. I felt the vacuum effect in my sinuses first, preceding the violence. The scent hit me a second later, not the antiseptic sting of bleach or the stale coffee of the night shift, but the metallic, copper-heavy tang of arterial spray mixed with the sharp, electric bite of ozone. Something had just burned, and someone was bleeding out fast. I didn't look up from the inventory chart I was faking. I forced my eyes to stay on the clipboard, counting the beats of my own heart. 52, 53, forcing the adrenaline to obey the mask of the invisible. Incompetent nurse. Then the double doors exploded inward. The hydraulic arms snapped with a sound like a gunshot, defeated by sheer kinetic velocity. A gurney careened into the bay, guided by panic rather than medical protocol. The sound was a sensory assault. The screech of locked rubber wheels skidding on wet linoleum, the guttural, wet roar of a man in terminal agony, and the sickening thud of a security guard being thrown against the triage wall like a rag doll. The guard slid down, leaving a smear of grease on the paint, unconscious, before his head hit the floor tiles. The man on the gurney was massive, a landscape of trauma spanning nearly 7 feet of muscle and scar tissue. Blood soaked the sheets, dark and viscous, pooling faster than the linens could absorb it. It dripped onto the floor with a rhythmic tap-tap-tap that sounded like a countdown. But the silence that followed the crash was louder. The entire ER staff froze, a collective inhalation of shock. I didn't freeze. My eyes flicked to the liquid oxygen tank bolted to the far wall, green light steady, pressure gauge in the optimal zone, and then to the sterile tray on the counter to my right. A number 10 scalpel sat there, wrapped in blue, sterile paper. Distance, 4 feet. Time to acquire, 0.8 seconds. Lethality, absolute. Vance, Dr. Aris Thorne's voice cut through the stunned room, high-pitched and laced with the specific, shrill arrogance of a man who feared lawsuits more than he feared death. Look at this mess. You left the crash cart in the lane again. He was pointing at a cart that hadn't moved in an hour. But facts didn't matter to men like Thorne. He needed a scapegoat for the chaos, a lightning rod to ground the staff's fear and assert his fragile control. I turned slowly, dropping my shoulders, curving my spine into the posture of the submissive, overwhelmed subordinate. I let my hands tremble. It was a tactical tremor, a calculated release of kinetic energy to sell the lie of fear. "I'm sorry. Doctor," I stammered, pitching my voice up an octave to make it breathable and weak. I thought, I moved it. Thorne stepped into my personal space, violating the sterile field. I smelled his stress, stale espresso, and expensive, cloying cologne masking the sour, acidic note of cortisol. He was posturing, checking the room to ensure his dominance was registered by the nurses and residents. To sell the humiliation, to make sure he saw only the clumsy nurse and not the Tier 1 operator who could collapse his trachea with a thumb strike before he blinked. I reached for a kidney dish on the metal tray. I fumbled it, deliberately. The stainless steel clattered against the tiled floor, a sharp, jarring dissonance that made everyone wince. Thorne sneered, his pupils dilated with contempt. Perfect. While he focused on the noise, I focused on the threat. I knelt to pick up the dish, using the low angle to scan the giant on the gurney from the ground up. He wasn't just big. He was modified. My eyes traced the distended veins in his neck, jugular venous distension pulsing against the skin, indicating cardiac tamponade or a tension pneumothorax building in his chest cavity. His skin was pale, clammy, and mottled at the extremities, classic signs of stage 3 hypovolemic shock. He was bleeding out internally. But his pupils... I leaned in closer, feigning a wipe of the floor with a paper towel. His pupils were blown wide, fixed, but his eyes were tracking. He was fighting a sedative load that would have dropped a horse. And then I saw it. A faint, rhythmic pulsing under the thick scar tissue of his left pectoral muscle, too high and too shallow for a pacemaker. A tracker. The pager on my hip buzzed again. A long, jagged vibration that synced perfectly with the pulse in his chest. This wasn't a patient. This was the package. And if the tracker was active, the hunters weren't minutes away. They were already breaching the perimeter. The hospital wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a kill box. The silence that followed the crash was heavy, pressurized by the sudden vacuum of violence. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the terrified calculations of civilians realizing they were no longer safe. The giant on the gurney thrashed. A tectonic shift of muscle and pain that snapped the leather restraints like wet paper. The sound of tearing leather was followed immediately by a nurse's scream. Brenda, I registered. A sharp, jagged sound that shattered the freeze. The giant's hand, the size of a shovel and slick with blood, flailed blindly, connecting with a metal IV pole. The pole bent under the impact, clattering to the floor. He was running on pure reptilian override, a biological machine stuck in a fight-or-die loop, unable to distinguish friend from foe. Dr. Thorne stumbled back, his face draining of colour, retreating behind the nurse's station like a child hiding from a storm. "Security!" he shrieked, his voice cracking and jumping registers. "Get him out of here. He's a liability. Reject the admission. I will not have this violence in my unit." I stood up. The transition happened in the space between heartbeats, a physiological shift as distinct as a gear change. The tactical tremor in my hands vanished instantly, locked down by muscle memory, honed in black sites whose names didn't exist on maps. My spine straightened, vertebrae stacking into an alignment of perfect mechanical efficiency. I didn't look at Thorne. I didn't look at the screaming nurse. I locked my eyes on the giant. The clumsy nurse mask dissolved, peeling away to reveal the cold, dead-eyed clinician underneath. I stepped into the kill zone. The air around him was thick, smelling of iron, raw sweat, and the chemical burn of high-grade military stimulants oozing from his pores. He roared, a sound that vibrated in the floorboards and rattled the glass of the supply cabinets, and lunged toward the nearest living thing. Me. I didn't retreat. I stepped inside his guard. It was a geometry problem, not a brawl. Force equals mass times acceleration, but leverage negates mass. As his arm swung around, a haymaker that would have decapitated a civilian or shattered a jawbone, I ducked under the arc, moving with the fluid precision of water. I could feel the wind of his fist passing inches above my scalp. I slipped behind him, my chest pressing against his back, my left arm snaking around his massive, tree-trunk neck. I didn't go for the windpipe. Crushing the trachea takes too long, causes panic, and leaves the target fighting for air. I went for the carotids, my forearm locked against the left side of his neck, my bicep against the right, creating a V-choke. I grabbed my own bicep, cinching the rear naked choke tight. The grip tightened like a hydraulic press, bypassing the embrace entirely, cutting off the blood supply to the brain. Eye contact. Target locked. Stand down. Ranger. My voice was no longer the breathable soprano of Elara the nurse. It was command voice, flat, timbreless, dropped an octave to a frequency that cut through panic and triggered deep brain compliance. It was the voice of a handler speaking to a weapon. The giant stiffened. His hands clawed at my arm, tearing the sleeves of my scrubs, scratching skin, but I adjusted my center of gravity, sinking my weight to anchor us both against the gurney. I felt the thrum of his carotid artery against my radius bone, fast, erratic, desperate. I squeezed, applying exactly 10 pounds of pressure. Not enough to kill. Just enough to reset the system. 1 second. 2. His struggles grew uncoordinated, his neural pathways firing misfires as oxygen deprivation set in. 3. 4. The roar died in his throat, replaced by a gurgle. Zulu X-ray. The code word was a key turning in a lock. I whispered it directly into his ear, low and hard, a secret shared in the chaos. His body went slack instantly, the fight draining out of him as the cerebral cortex starved for oxygen. 6 seconds. That was all it took. He collapsed backward. I rode him down to the floor, controlling the descent with my knees so his head didn't crack against the linoleum. The impact shuddered through my legs, a heavy, dead weight. Silence rushed back into the room, absolute and terrifying. I looked up. Dr. Thorne was staring at me from over the counter. His mouth was open, but no words came out. He looked at the unconscious giant, sprawling across the tiles like a fallen statue, and then at me, the small, clumsy woman who had just choked out a monster in 6 seconds flat. He saw the way I held myself, the way my eyes scanned the exits, the way I checked my own pulse. The mask was gone, and we both knew he had seen something he was never supposed to survive seeing. The sound of the security feed rewinding was a digital screech, a high-pitched compression artifact that grated against the base of my skull like a dental drill hitting a nerve. It harmonized with the incessant 60-cycle hum of the cooling fans in the server racks and the flicker of overhead fluorescents, creating a sonic landscape of jagged, headache-inducing tension. I stood in the far corner of the cramped security booth, arms crossed tight against my chest, feigning the posture of a traumatized civilian trying to make herself small. But inside the mask, my eyes were dissecting the room geometry with cold precision. 3 exits. 1 blocked by Captain Miller, the CPD officer who was currently shaking the freezing rain off his heavy Kevlar vest, sending droplets of dirty Chicago water onto the linoleum. 1 behind Dr. Thorne, currently blocked by his frantic, erratic pacing. The 3rd was the ventilation grate above the main console, tight, maybe 12 inches by 8, but viable if I dislocated a shoulder. The air in the booth was stagnant and thick, smelling of stale coffee, overheating electronics, and the sharp, acidic tang of Thorne's sweat. It was the smell of a man realizing his insurance premiums were about to skyrocket, and looking for someone to blame. I want an incident report filed immediately. Right now. Thorne slammed his palm against the laminate desk, the vibration rattling a cup of lukewarm water and sending ripples across the surface. The use of force continuum was violated. Grossly. I saw it. You saw it. He pointed, a trembling, manic finger at the monitor, where the frozen frame showed a blur of motion. Me, blurred into a ghost. And Silas, a pixelated mountain in the process of falling. Thorne wasn't angry. He was terrified. He was using procedural language like a shield, throwing up walls of liability, accountability, and protocol to protect himself from the visceral reality of what had just happened in his ER. He needed this to be a lawsuit, not a black op, because a lawsuit was something he understood. This woman, he hissed, refusing to look at me directly, treating me like a contagion, is a liability. Look at the tape. Miller, just look at the technique. The security guard, a heavy-set man named Davila, whose uniform was straining at the seams, hit play with a reluctant finger. The footage rolled. On the grainy LCD screen, the giant lunged. The nurse, me, didn't flinch. The takedown happened in exactly 4 frames of video. Even at 30 frames per second, I was a smear of kinetic efficiency. Thorne hit pause again, stabbing the button. He zoomed in. The resolution was poor, breaking the image into blocky artifacts. But the physics were undeniable. The timestamp showed the engagement lasted exactly 5.8 seconds from contact to unconsciousness. Thorne pointed at the giant's neck on the screen. There, he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and awe. Look at the bruising pattern. That's not a struggle. That's surgical. The bruise forming on Silas's neck wasn't a messy contusion. It was a perfect V-shape, the imprint of a radius bone and a bicep acting as a hydraulic clamp. It was the signature of a blood choke applied by someone who knew exactly how many pounds of pressure per square inch were required to occlude the carotid artery without crushing the larynx or severing the spinal cord. Captain Miller stepped forward, bringing the scent of wet wool, gun oil, and damp pavement into my personal space. He was older, eyes tired and rimmed with red, the kind of cop who had seen enough Chicago violence to know the difference between a lucky shot and a professional hit. He looked at the screen, analysing the leverage, then turned slowly to look at me. You got a name? Nurse, he asked, his voice gravelly, like tyres on gravel. I held up my hands, palms out, playing the role. Elara, I whispered, forcing a tremor into my fingers. I reacted. My brother. He wrestled in high school. I used to watch him. It was a weak lie, thin as paper, dissolving under scrutiny. Miller didn't buy it. His eyes dropped to my right hand. He wasn't looking at the tremor I was faking. He was looking at the ridge of calloused skin on the web of my thumb and index finger, the shooter's callus formed by thousands of hours of friction against a pistol grip. Wrestled, Miller repeated, flatly, the word hanging in the air like a challenge. He reached out, not to arrest me, but to inspect the hand. I let him take it. His thumb brushed the callus. A rough, deliberate friction. For a microsecond, the mask slipped. I calculated the break. A simple wrist lock, a hyperextension of the elbow to snap the joint, a shove into Thorne to clear the lane. My heart rate didn't spike. It dropped. 50 beats per minute. The physiological state of a predator about to ambush. There's a lot of FOD on the floor out there, Miller said. using the term foreign object debris, a military aviation term, wildly out of place for a beat cop. He stared at me, testing the reaction. You moved like you've cleared debris before. Like you know how to handle a crash site. Thorne spun around, sensing the shift in the room's gravity, but missing the subtext entirely. Captain, arrest her. Or at least, detain her. This is a liability nightmare. Before Miller could answer, the monitor behind them flickered violently. The timestamp froze. The image of the ER warped, distorted by a wave of magnetic static, and then cut to absolute black. The static on the monitor served as a prelude, not a glitch. The speaker system in the ceiling crackled. Avit, popping sound like a spine snapping, followed by a burst of high-frequency white noise that made Dr. Thorne flinch and cover his ears. Then came the voice. It lacked humanity. It was a synthesized, pre-recorded baritone, stripped of all inflection, empathy, or hesitation. It was the voice of a machine executing a logic gate, broadcasting a death sentence in the tone of a weather report. Code orange. Biohazard containment. Do not exit. The announcement hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Before the echo died, the building responded. The magnetic locks on the heavy double doors at the end of the corridor engaged with a resonant thud-clank, the sound of steel bolts driving home into reinforced concrete frames. The lights overhead flickered once, then stabilized at a lower, amber hue. Emergency power. The air circulation system groaned and reversed pitch, the intake fans cutting out and the exhaust fans spinning up to create negative pressure. I felt the change in my ears. A sudden, sharp pop as the barometric pressure dropped, sealing the building like a submarine diving. The smell of the ER changed instantly. The flow of fresh rain, scented air from the ambulance bay was cut off, replaced by the recycled, sterile stagnation of a sealed loop. It was the smell of a tomb. Captain Miller grabbed his radio, his thumb jamming the transmit button. Dispatch. This is Unit 4 Alpha. We have a lockdown at Mercy. We are sealed in... What is the... He stopped. He tapped the radio against his palm. Dead air. Just the hiss of static. He pulled his personal cell phone from his vest. No service. He muttered, the colour draining from his face as he stared at the screen. 0 bars. SOS mode only. I checked my own mental inventory. Cell yummers. High-powered, military-grade spectrum denial. They weren't just locking the doors. They were severing the digital throat of the hospital. Thorne was hyperventilating now, clawing at his tie as if it was strangling him. Code orange? That's impossible. We don't have an infectious intake. This is a mistake. I need to call the board. He scrambled for the landline on the security desk, putting the receiver to his ear. He froze. No dial tone. Just the rhythmic, mocking silence of a dead line. I moved away from them, stepping out of the security booth and back into the amber-lit corridor. The clumsy nurse was gone. I walked with the rolling gait of an operator on patrol, placing my feet silently heel to toe to feel the vibrations in the floor. I closed my eyes for a second, filtering out Thorne's panic and Miller's cursing, tuning my auditory cortex to the environment. I listened for what was underneath the silence. And there it was. A low-frequency thrum, felt in the sternum more than heard. Thump, thump, thump. Rapid, muffled, and getting louder. It wasn't a news chopper. The frequency was too low. It wasn't a standard medevac. The blade slap was dampened, missing the characteristic chop of a standard rotor. Stealth rotor. A modified Black Hawk or a Ghost Bird, with noise-cancelling tail rotors, designed to insert teams without waking the neighbours. This isn't the CDC, I whispered to no one, the realisation cold in my stomach. The CDC doesn't jam cell towers. The CDC doesn't use stealth transport. This was a sanitization team. A cleaning crew. They weren't here to cure a disease. They were here to burn the petri dish and bury the ashes. Thorne ran past me, heading for the main glass doors, banging his fists against the reinforced glass, screaming at the police cruisers that were visibly retreating, pulling back to a perimeter 3 blocks away. They were abandoning the containment zone, following the lethal logic of biohazard protocol. "They're leaving!" Thorne screamed, his voice cracking. "Why are they leaving us?" I turned the other way. Toward the trauma bay. Toward Silas. The logic was cold and binary. The hunters were coming for the asset. If I wanted to survive, I couldn't run away from the target. I had to get to him first. I broke into a run, not a nurse's shuffle, but a sprinter's drive, heading straight into the heart of the contamination zone. The transition from the hallway to the trauma bay was a descent into a different circle of hell. The main overhead halogens had died the moment the lockdown grid slammed home, killed by the master circuit breaker to save load for the life support systems. Now, the room was bathed in a deep, viscous crimson, a submarine lighting scheme designed to preserve night vision, but currently serving only to make the spilled blood on the floor look like pools of motor oil. The silence was heavy, pressurized by the absence of the ventilation hum. In its place was the low-frequency drone of the uninterruptible power supply banks kicking in somewhere in the walls. A throbbing wub-wub-wub-wub that vibrated through the soles of my rubber shoes and settled in the hollow of my chest. It felt less like a hospital and more like the fail-secure airlock of a sinking vessel. The air was stagnant, losing its chill, beginning to warm with the heat of machinery and the smell of copper. I reached Silas. He wasn't moving. The massive rise and fall of his chest, which had been rhythmic moments ago, had shallowed to a terrifying degree. I placed 2 fingers against his carotid artery. The pulse was thready, erratic, struggling against a chemical tide. It fluttered like a trapped bird, fast, then slow, then a long pause that made my own heart skip. The standard ER sedation protocol, midazolam and fentanyl, should have kept him docile but breathing. But his physiology was wrong. His metabolic burn rate was eating the sedatives unevenly, causing a paradoxical respiratory depression while his adrenal system fought to redline. He wasn't just sleeping, he was crashing. His body was shutting down the diaphragm to preserve oxygen for the brain, a survival reflex gone wrong. I reached into my scrub pocket and pulled out the silver challenge coin. I didn't look at it. I just let it spin across my knuckles, the cold metal biting into the skin, a tactile anchor grounding me while my mind raced through the toxicology math. Mass, 140 kilograms. Tolerance, enhanced. Status, respiratory failure, imminent. I stopped the coin with a sharp snap against my palm. Decision made. I cracked the seal on the crash cart. Bypassing the digital inventory log with a manual override key, I kept on my lanyard. My hands moved with independent intelligence, ignoring the tremor that tried to creep back into my fingers. I grabbed 3 ampoules. Naloxone, to strip the opioids from his receptors. Epinephrine, to kickstart the cardiac rhythm. And a 16-gauge needle, the kind usually reserved for tension pneumothorax. I didn't bother with an IV port. His veins were collapsing, retreating from the surface to preserve core heat. I needed a central line, or something faster. I snapped the neck of the epinephrine ampule, a sharp pop that sounded like a pistol crack in the red silence. Drawing the fluid, I watched the bubble rise in the syringe, bathed in bloodlight. As I turned, my elbow brushed against the high-pressure oxygen regulator mounted on the wall. A yellow warning decal, peeling at the edges, caught the red light. Danger. Jet blast hazard. Keep clear. It was an industrial warning for a medical device, a remnant of the military surplus gear Mercy General bought to cut costs. It felt like an omen. I positioned the needle over his sternum. Intracardiaque injection. It was a move from the movies to civilians, but a desperate, rib-cracking reality for operators in the field when the lines were down. You don't just stab. You have to navigate the intercostal space, avoid the bone, and hit the ventricular muscle without piercing the lung or nicking the coronary artery. I exhaled, emptying my lungs to steady my core. Come back to the fight. Ranger, I whispered. I drove the needle down. The resistance of the scar tissue was dense, like punching through cured leather. Then, the pop of the fascia. Then, the spongy resistance of the muscle. I depressed the plunger. 1 second. Tfor. The chemicals hit his system like a localized lightning strike. Silas didn't just wake up. He detonated. His back arched off the gurney, snapping the plastic railguard like a dry twig. A gasp tore out of his throat. A ragged, vacuum-sealed sound of lungs violently reinflating, sucking the thin air of the room into starved alveoli. His eyes flew open, not grogged, but wide, dilated, and terrifyingly absent. The pupils were blown black holes, absorbing the red light. He wasn't seeing the ER. He wasn't seeing me. He was seeing whatever nightmare I had just ripped him out of. A desert ambush, a black site interrogation, or the moment he died the first time. His hand shot out, blin, and faced, grabbing the metal rail of the bed and crushing the aluminum tubing until his knuckles turned white. The machine was back online, but the safety protocols were offline. I froze, turning my head slightly to the left, tuning out the harsh, ragged rasp of Silas's breathing to focus on the corridor outside. The heavy, magnetic locked doors muffled the world, reducing the chaos of the hospital to a dull roar. But they couldn't hide the specific acoustics of professional violence. Foot, foot, foot. The sound was dull, vit, and rhythmic, like someone slapping a wet towel against concrete. Suppressed carbine fire. 5.56 6mm subsonic rounds, cycling through a baffled can. Then the thump of a body hitting the floor. No scream, just the drop. Then silence again. Then the distinct scuff step of tactical boots moving in a stack formation on the linoleum. They were sweeping the hall. Efficient. Methodical. No yelling. No radio chatter. Just the breathing of men in respirators and the friction of synthetic gear against armor. Silas moved before I could process the exit strategy. He rolled off the gurney, his massive frame hitting the floor with a heavy, meat-packing thud that I felt in my teeth. He didn't try to stand. He launched. He was in a fugue state. A kill mode loop, triggered by the adrenaline spike and the threat proximity. He didn't see an ally. He saw a target. He slammed me against the supply cabinet, his forearm pinning my throat before I could raise a guard. The glass doors of the cabinet shattered above us, raining shards down, like glitter in the red light. His strength was hydraulic. Impossible. The kind of force that crushes larynxes by accident. The smell coming off him was intense. Chemical fear, old sweat, and the metallic tang of the epinephrine I had just pumped into his heart. End quote. I didn't fight the force. You don't fight a landslide. You redirect it. My vision greyed at the edges as my oxygen supply cut off. But my mind stayed cold, analysing the leverage points. Threat. Friendly fire. Solution. EFF. Reset. I didn't claw at his arm. I hooked my leg behind his knee, destroying his base of support, and twisted my hips to slide out from the crush zone. We hit the floor together, a tangle of limbs and broken glass. He scrambled to mount, his fist raising for a hammer blow that would cave in my skull. I caught his wrist, not to stop it, but to guide it past my ear, and slapped my palm hard against the center of his chest, right over the tracker scar. Sandstorm actual. I screamed the code phrase, putting every ounce of command authority into the syllables, dropping my voice into that flat, resonant register that cuts through panic. Sandstorm actual. Eyes on. Eyes on. The fist stopped inches from my face. The wind of the motion blew a stray lock of hair across my eyes. Silas froze, his body trembling with the kinetic energy he was frantically trying to break. The pupils, still blown wide, contracted sharply, focusing for the first time. The animal rage receded, replaced by a confused, agonizing recognition. He blinked, the sweat dripping from his nose onto my cheek. He recognized the code. He recognized the voice. And then, finally, he recognized the face. He pulled back, rolling off me with a grunt of pain, putting his back against the cabinets, his chest heaving. I scrambled up, ignoring the glass shards digging into my palms, and pressed my back against the door frame, checking the gap. The shadows under the door stopped moving. The scuff step had halted. They had heard the struggle. They were stacking up on the other side of the magnetic lock. I looked at Silas. He wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a weapon that had just come online. and he was looking at me not with gratitude, but with the cold, professional assessment of a soldier waiting for orders. The time for nursing was over. The breach was coming. The hiss was the first warning. A sharp, sibilant escape of pressurized gas that cut through the muffled thrum of the lockdown like a scalpel through silence. I didn't look back at Silas, who was leaning against the crash cart, his chest heaving with the aftershocks of the epinephrine. My eyes were locked on the regulator valve of the main liquid oxygen line running along the corridor wall. The yellow warning decal I had noted earlier, "Jet blast hazard, do not obstruct," was no longer a generic OSHA safety advisory. It was a tactical invitation written in industrial bold sans serif. The corridor outside the trauma bay was a fatal funnel, a geometric kill zone where two vectors of fire would intersect the moment those heavy magnetic doors breached. I could hear them stacking up beyond the steel, the distinct clack-clack of ceramic plates shifting against polymer rifle stocks, the synchronized, rhythmic breathing of men who hunted for a living. They were operating in the dark, likely using quad-tube panoramic night vision goggles, turning this red-lit, power-downed hallway into a high-definition green phosphor stadium. For us, trapped in the amber gloom of emergency lighting, it was a tome. I needed to change the physics of the engagement. I needed to blind the gods. I reached for the emergency shut-off wheel, but instead of closing it to secure the line, I grabbed the breaker bar and wrenched the valve wide open, snapping the safety wire with a violent, metallic ping. The pipe groaned, a metal-on-metal screech that sounded like a dying animal, and then the seal failed. A jet of cryogenic fog, 300 degrees below zero, erupted into the corridor. It hit the floor and expanded instantly. A rolling wave of white death that swallowed the linoleum. The expansion ratio of liquid to gas was nearly 800 to 1. Within seconds, the floor ceased to exist. The temperature dropped so fast I felt the moisture in my nostrils crystallize into tiny, sharp needles. The air turned opaque. Adinse, swirling cloud that killed visibility in less than 2 heartbeats. But fog wasn't enough. Modern thermal optics would cut right through the cold vapor, seeing our heat signatures as bright beacons in the mist. I needed heat. I needed a supernova to burn out their retinas. I grabbed the portable convection heater from the wall mount, the heavy-duty unit used to warm hypothermic shock victims, and smashed its thermostat control against the concrete wall, shorting the safety circuit. Sparks showered down, fizzing in the cryogenic fog. I threw the unit into the center of the fog bank, right under the main vent, and kicked it face up. The heating coils flared instantly, glowing bright, angry orange, fighting the cryogenic cold. The reaction was violent and immediate. The sudden temperature differential created a thermal bloom, a massive, chaotic spike of heat radiation. To the naked eye, it was just swirling steam. But to anyone wearing thermal or light amplification gear, looking down that hallway would be like staring directly into a nuclear flash. The washout effect would overload their senses, turning their carefully calibrated green phosphor world into a blinding, searing wall of white static. Target fixation. I whispered the term to myself. A mantra of focus to keep my own mind from locking onto the terror of the breach. I didn't watch the fog. I watched the magnetic lock on the far doors. It disengaged with a resonant thunk. The doors swung open. 3 silhouettes appeared in the swirling mist, moving with the confident, fluid aggression of men who owned the dark. Then they stopped. Their heads snapped back. Their hands flew to their helmets, tearing at their goggles in a panic. The bloom had hit them. They were blind, their optics washed out by the thermal spike. "Now!" I screamed, my voice cracking in the freezing air. Silas didn't hesitate. He launched himself into the whiteout, a massive, unstoppable kinetic projectile. He hit the lead operator with the force of a freight train derailment. I heard the sickening crunch of composite armor shattering under impact and the wet gasp of wind being driven out of a human body. The corridor erupted into chaos. Shouts, blind fire sparking wildly against the walls, and the roar of the giant reclaiming his territory. The hallway disintegrated into a storm of plaster dust and deafening noise. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound of suppressed rounds punching through drywall was distinct. A dry, percussive impact that sent plumes of white powder exploding into the red-lit air. They weren't aiming, they were suppressing. The squad had recovered from the thermal blind faster than I anticipated, falling back to a spray-and-pray doctrine to pin us down. We were cornered in a dead-end supply alcove, a 10-by-10 box that was rapidly becoming a coffin. The air tasted of chalk, copper, and the acrid burn of propellant. Splinters from the door frame rained down on us like jagged confetti as rounds chewed through the wood. I pressed myself flat against the floor, feeling the vibrations of the bullets impacting the studs inches above my head. The spalling from the wall, tiny, razor-sharp fragments of gypsum and paint, peppered my cheek, drawing blood. Silas was crouched beside me, his massive frame filling the small space. He was bleeding from a graze on his deltoid, the dark blood mixing with the white plaster dust to form a grey, muddy paste on his skin. He wasn't panting. He was assessing. He tapped the wall behind us with a knuckle. It wasn't concrete. It yielded slightly. It was standard commercial drywall over metal studs. A partition wall. To a civilian. It was a barrier, the end of the line. To a breacher. It was a door you hadn't opened yet. He looked at me, his eyes clearing of the fog of rage, replaced by the cold geometry of survival. He pointed at the wall, then made a fist. "Mouse hole?" He grunted. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of physics. He stood up, ignoring the rounds chewing through the door behind us, moving with a terrifying disregard for the lethal geometry of the room. He didn't use a tool. He used himself. He stepped back one pace, coiled his power like a compression spring, and drove his shoulder into the space between 2 studs. The impact was sickening. Avit, meaty thud, followed by the sharp crack of drywall snapping. He didn't stop. He piston drove his body through the barrier, turning his shoulder into a battering ram. The wall exploded outward. Dust billowed in a thick, choking cloud. Jagged edges of gypsum board tore at his skin, and I saw a metal stud bend and screech as 280 pounds of force warped it out of the way. He grunted. A low, guttural sound of effort and pain. as he forced his bulk through the narrow, jagged opening he had created. I didn't wait for the dust to settle. Target fixation applied to escape. 2. You don't look at the bullets. You look at the gap. I scrambled through the hole after him, scraping my ribs against the broken drywall, feeling the sharp bite of a screw catch my scrub top. I tumbled out onto the floor of the adjacent room. It was dark, silent, and smelled of industrial laundry detergent. The linen closet. We had bypassed the kill zone. But as I rolled to my feet, checking Silas for catastrophic damage, I heard it. Not behind us, but above us. The low, rhythmic thump-thump of the stealth rotor. It wasn't hovering anymore. It was landing. The vibrations travelled down the steel girders of the building, vibrating the floor beneath my feet. The hunters hadn't just breached the hall. They were putting boots on the roof. The mouse hole had bought us seconds, but the trap was closing from the sky. The room I had tumbled into was a linen closet, a cramped, windowless box, smelling of industrial bleach, starch, and the stale heat of confined air. But the real sensory assault was coming from above. The low-frequency thrum of the stealth rotor on the roof wasn't just a noise anymore. It was a physical pressure wave pushing down through the acoustic ceiling tiles, vibrating the wire racks of towels like guitar strings. Thump, thump, thump. It was the heartbeat of a predator preparing to feed. They were inserting a second team. Vertical envelopment. We were being pincered between the shooters suppressing the hallway and the fresh assets dropping from the sky. I looked at Silas. He was covered in drywall dust, a ghost made of plaster and dried blood, his chest heaving like a bellows as his body metabolized the combat stims. But his eyes were clear. The kill mode fugue was gone, replaced by the cold, tactical processing of an operator running the numbers. He held up 2 fingers, dirty with gypsum, then pointed a massive finger to the ceiling. 2 minutes to breach. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing through the hospital schematics I had memorized 3 years ago, overlaying blueprints onto the terrified reality of the moment. We were in the West Wing, 3rd floor. This linen closet wasn't just a closet. It shared a load, bearing wall with the main supply riser, the vertical artery that carried power, data, and the pneumatic tube system for the entire wing. The riser. I whispered, the words scraping my dry throat. It's our only vertical exit. And it's our only weapon. Silas nodded. He didn't need a speech. He grabbed the heavy steel shelving unit bolted to the wall and ripped it free with a grunt of effort, the metal shrieking as the masonry anchors tore out of the concrete block like rotten teeth. Behind it was a maintenance panel, painted the same institutional beige as the wall. Access. I popped the latch with the edge of my silver coin, the metal biting into the soft paint. The panel swung open, revealing a dark, vertical shaft filled with cabling and the shiny, transparent pipes of the pneumatic system. It was tight, hot, and smelled of burning dust and ozone. But it wasn't the fibre optic cables I was looking for. Phoebe's fist, but it's fragile. It's digital. And right now, digital was dead. The jammers outside were screaming on every frequency from 4G to military UHF. I needed the old world. I needed the legacy infrastructure that nobody bothered to shield because nobody thought to use it. Buried behind the colourful bundles of Cat6 was a thick, grey cable, a 25-pair POTS line. Plain old telephone service. The analogue backbone. Copper wire didn't care about radio frequencies. Copper was physics. Copper was a physical bridge to the outside world. I pulled the handset from my scrub pocket, a lineman's butt set I had stolen from maintenance months ago, kept for exactly this kind of worst-case scenario. I stripped the grey sheathing with my teeth, tasting the bitter, chemical tang of the plastic, and clipped the alligator leads onto the exposed copper pairs. Tip and ring. The connection hissed, a sound like static rain, then settled into a clear, beautiful dial tone. The sound of the outside world. The sound of survival. I didn't call the police. I didn't call the FBI. I punched in a number I had sworn never to use. Affix line. A secure, analogue receiver sitting in a basement office in Langley that hadn't changed since the Cold War. I wasn't sending a voice message. Voice can be faked. Voice can be denied. I was sending data. I pulled the small, folded thermal printout from my pocket. Silas's biometric scan from the initial triage, the one showing the tracker ID, the impossible blood chemistry, and the time-stamped location. I fed the strip into the portable scanner attachment on the butt set. It whirred to life, a high-pitched digital scream, encoding the truth into audio pulses. Scree ovoga, ch. The sound of a handshake. The sound of a dead man's switch being toggled. It was the sound of a nuclear option. I grabbed the PA mic, hanging on the wall of the riser. The emergency override for the floor. I keyed it. My voice boomed through the speakers in the hallway, through the ceiling tiles, reaching the men stacking up outside the door and the ones fast roping onto the roof. Victor Actual. This is Sandstorm. I am currently transmitting a Level 5 biometric packet to the Assistant Director's secure fax line via hardline copper. The packet contains the asset's vitals, location, and your unit's interference signature. The transmission is 80% complete. You have 30 seconds to abort and clear the airspace, or your faces and your funding will be on the evening news. This is not a negotiation. This is a liability update. The thrum of the rotor on the roof changed pitch. It hesitated. The physics of the battlefield had just shifted from kinetics to politics. The silence that followed my transmission was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a vacuum. The gunfire in the hallway stopped mid-burst. The scuff of boots ceased. Even the rotor on the roof seemed to hold its breath, the blade slap slowing to an idle whine that vibrated the fillings in my teeth. For 10 seconds, the only sound in the riser shaft was the screech of the modem finishing its handshake. It was the sound of a career ending, of a black budget operation being exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of bureaucratic accountability. Commander Voss was a professional. He wasn't a zealot. He knew the math. A dead asset could be explained as a training accident or a medical failure. An exposed operation, with hard evidence faxed directly to oversight and a paper trail generated on a secure line, could not. The rotor pitch changed again. Whine, thump, thump. It wasn't landing. It was lifting. The downwash pressure on the roof eased, the building exhaling as the weight was removed. In the hallway, I heard the distinctive sound of a tactical retreat, the disciplined, backward movement of a team collapsing its perimeter. No shouting, no panic, just the rapid, rhythmic retreat of men who knew the mission was burned. They were scrubbing the site, pulling back to the shadows before the local police perimeter could push in. The jammer signal cut out, and my pager buzzed once. A service restoration notification, then went silent. The trap had opened. I slumped against the rough concrete wall of the shaft, the adrenaline crash hitting me like a physical blow, turning my legs to water. Silas was watching me. He didn't smile. He didn't thank me. He just nodded, a slow, deep dip of his chin. It was a warrior's salute. Mission accomplished. He turned to the service ladder in the shaft. It led down to the sub-basement, to the steam tunnels, to the ghost road out of the city. He looked back at me, waiting. I shook my head. I couldn't go. My cover was blown. Yes, but my daughter was still in the city. I had to stay. I had to be the decoy. I had to be the smoke that hid the fire. Silas understood. He disappeared into the darkness of the shaft, a giant moving with the silence of a whisper, fading into the infrastructure of the building he was designed to destroy. I waited until the sound of his descent faded completely, until I was alone with the dust and the ghosts. Then I stepped back out into the ruined room. I walked to the desk Dr. Thorne had used earlier. It was covered in dust and debris, a testament to the violence that had just occurred. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver challenge coin. I placed it in the center of the desk. Right on top of the incident report, Thorne had been trying to file. The metal clicked against the laminate. A receipt. A signature. A warning. The doors to the corridor burst open. Not Vector Squad. Captain Miller. He led a team of SWAT officers, their weapon lights cutting through the gloom, blindingly bright, shouting commands that overlapped into chaos. Hence, show me your hands. Down. Get down. I raised my hands slowly, my face empty, my eyes dull. I let the tremor return to my fingers. The clumsy nurse was back, but the mask was thinner now, translucent, like scar tissue. Dr. Thorne pushed past the cops, his white coat stained with plaster dust, his face a mask of confusion and terror. He looked at the hole in the wall. He looked at the empty room where the liability had been. He looked at me. And then he looked at the desk. He saw the coin. His eyes widened. He picked it up, feeling the weight of it, the worn edges of a history he was terrified to understand. He looked at me, his mouth opening to ask the question that would ruin him if he asked it aloud. I met his gaze. I didn't blink. I didn't speak. I just watched him realize that the world was larger, darker, and more dangerous than his liability waivers could ever cover. He held the coin like it was radioactive. Some heroes wear capes, some wear scrubs, and some don't exist at all. The screen faded to black as the police lights washed over my face, turning the world into a strobing nightmare of blue and red. The siren wail, finally piercing the silence,